call came in 2003, 14 years after Duncan McPherson vanished, and it was the sound of a shattering assumption. For all that time, his family, a continent away in Saskatoon, Canada, had lived in a perpetual, agonizing limbo, their hope a fragile thing perpetually battered by the silence of the Austrian Alps. Duncan, a promising defenseman drafted by the New York Islanders, a 23-year-old on the cusp of a new life coaching hockey in Scotland, had simply disappeared in August of 1989. The initial narrative, the one reluctantly accepted by most authorities in the Tyrolean region, was simple, and in its simplicity cruelly dismissive. A restless young man, a handsome Canadian athlete, had chosen to abandon his obligations, perhaps gone off with a woman, a victim of his own youthful wanderlust. This was the official story, the one repeated back to his increasingly desperate parents, Bob and Linda McPherson, who knew their son's character with an intimate, unshakable certainty. They knew he would never simply vanish. They knew the vibrant thread of his life had been violently, abruptly severed. Their search, which began only days after he missed his flight to Dundee, was met with a chilling, frustrating wall of indifference. The local police in Innsbruck seemed fundamentally unwilling to engage with the possibility of foul play or even a serious accident. They pointed to the majestic, deceptive vastness of the mountains. The Alps, they suggested with a shrug, claimed countless souls. The vast, indifferent wilderness was the only suspect they were interested in pursuing. But Bob and Linda refused to accept the easy out, the bureaucratic dismissal. They flew to Austria, a pilgrimage of dread and determination, and began an investigation that the local authorities had refused to execute. They discovered that Duncan had been last seen at the Stubai Glacier resort, having rented a snowboard for what he likely thought would be a final, exhilarating run before his career transition. It was here, in the shadow of the colossal Stubai Glacier, that the trail had run cold. Weeks into their own painstaking search, a major break emerged that only served to deepen the mystery. Duncan's borrowed car, a small Opel, was discovered abandoned in the resort's parking lot. This was the first material proof that he had indeed been here, and that whatever happened, it happened on the mountain, not in some distant romantic elopement. Its discovery 6 weeks after his disappearance should have triggered a massive police operation. Instead, the police simply processed the vehicle and returned to their initial lazy conclusion. They had the mountain, they had the car, they had the last known location. Yet the search stalled, choked by an incomprehensible apathy that the McPhersons would fight against for over a decade. The mountain itself became a character in this tragedy, an immense, silent behemoth of granite and ice, a cold, vast cathedral holding secrets. The sheer scale of the Stubai Glacier, a frozen, moving river of ice, represented the magnitude of their loss and the impossibility of their task. The McPhersons returned year after year, often alone, driven by a parent's profound instinctual refusal to surrender to a lie. They funded their own searches, hired mountain guides, and distributed thousands of posters, their annual ritual of grief and hope becoming a whispered legend among the local community. The silence of the Alps was occasionally broken by their appeals, their quiet certainty that something had happened here, something that the mountain was holding prisoner. They were searching for a piece of clothing, a personal item, any shred of evidence that would confirm their darkest fears. Yet all they found was the relentless, crushing white. The years bled into one another, turning the hopeful, vibrant memory of a young athlete into a cold case, a missing persons file gathering dust on an Austrian desk. For 14 long, grinding years, Duncan McPherson was a ghost in the machine, a memory preserved in the family's heart, but lost to the world. A promising life swallowed whole by the formidable, uncaring majesty of the ice. The emotional weight bore down on the McPhersons, transforming their lives into a permanent investigation, a cross-continental quest for a truth that seemed intentionally obscured. The dramatic tension lay in the simple, terrifying question: was this a tragic accident of nature? Or had something more sinister occurred? Something that someone, or many people, had gone to great lengths to conceal beneath the vast, ever-shifting white blanket of the Stubai Glacier? They waited, they searched, and they held their breath, never truly knowing if Duncan was resting peacefully in a hidden crevasse or if his end had been far, far worse. The waiting ended in the summer of 2003, on the very slopes where Duncan McPherson was last seen. A heat wave of unusual intensity had swept across Europe, causing the glacial ice to retreat dramatically, exposing secrets that had been locked away for millennia. The relentless thawing revealed a dark stain on the pristine white canvas of the glacier, a grotesque anomaly near the Eisgrat lift station, an area frequented by tourists and groomed nightly by massive machinery. A resort employee, performing a routine check, spotted something foreign jutting from the ice, a piece of fabric, a flash of blue. As the melting continued, the extent of the discovery became horrifyingly clear. It was a body, preserved in the ice for 14 years, and the identification was chillingly immediate. The remains belonged to Duncan McPherson. The macabre finding was a devastating confirmation of the McPhersons' worst fears, yet it simultaneously shattered the established narrative of the runaway athlete. Duncan had not fled. He had been right where his parents had suspected, swallowed by the mountain, but not in a simple, unavoidable fall into a random crevasse. The location of the discovery, in the middle of a prepared, heavily trafficked ski run, a gentle slope that was the resort's circulatory system, was profoundly significant. It immediately suggested that his death was not the result of an isolated extreme climbing or backcountry accident. This area was not a treacherous, unmarked wilderness. It was a commercial operation, a carefully managed environment. This shift in location, from the vast, ambiguous wilderness to the controlled environment of the slope, immediately moved the death from the column of unfortunate natural accident to the column of deeply suspicious incident. The physical state of the remains further amplified the horror and the mystery. The body, frozen for nearly a decade and a half, was missing both forearms and the lower portion of his left leg. The injuries were not the clean breaks of a fall, nor the ravages of exposure and animal activity. They were traumatic amputations, and their sheer violence suggested a catastrophic, mechanized encounter. The sight of the remains, as described in later reports, spoke of an unnatural crushing force, one that had brutally dismembered the young man's body. The police, finally forced to acknowledge the grim reality of Duncan's fate, maintained their initial reflexive position. It was an accident, a fall into a shallow crevasse, and the subsequent movement of the glacier had caused the mutilation. But this explanation was a fragile shield against a tidal wave of doubt. Forensic experts, when finally consulted by the McPhersons, who, once again, had to push against official resistance, quickly and decisively contradicted the Tyrolean police. The experts examined the injuries, particularly the clean, violent severance of the limbs, and concluded that they were highly consistent with being struck and mangled by heavy machinery. On a ski slope, at night, the only piece of heavy machinery operating is the piston bully, the massive, multi-ton snow grooming machine, also known as a snowcat. The new darker line of inquiry was immediate and terrifying. Duncan McPherson had not simply fallen, he had been killed by a resort vehicle, and his body subsequently hidden beneath the snow and ice. The investigators' initial focus then shifted from finding a lost hiker to reconstructing a fatal clandestine encounter. The narrative of the snowcat driver became the central focus. It was a blindingly foggy night on August 9th, 1989. Duncan, after his last known interaction, a conversation with a lift operator about the conditions, had likely gone up the slope for one final snowboard run. Did he take a terrible fall, breaking his leg and becoming incapacitated? Was he lying on the slope, perhaps in the fog, waiting for rescue that would never come? The sheer tonnage of a snowcat, operated at night in poor visibility, could easily have run over a fallen, injured person, inflicting the type of horrific, dismembering trauma seen on Duncan's remains. The question that loomed over the entire case, the one that turned a tragic accident into a potential cover-up, was this. If the death was an accident, why was the body found in a location that suggested it had been deliberately moved and buried? The initial assumption of a simple, natural demise was not just wrong. It appeared to be a purposeful misdirection. The emotional toll on the McPhersons, who had finally found their son only to have the circumstances of his death become a Gordian knot of official obfuscation and circumstantial horror, was profound. They had their son back, but the peace of a simple, tragic death was denied to them. They were now fighting a new battle, one against an established resort and an indifferent justice system, demanding not just recognition of his death, but the truth of his final, terrifying moments, and the answer to who knew and who buried the young Canadian hockey player. The silence of the mountain was now compounded by the silence of the men who worked on it, a conspiracy of quiet that seemed designed to protect a reputation over a human life. The forensic analysis became the crucial weapon in the McPhersons' fight for truth. With the Austrian authorities clinging to the untenable Glacier movement theory, Bob and Linda McPherson commissioned their own experts in North America and the UK. The evidence was presented to a range of specialists, forensic pathologists, trauma surgeons, and accident reconstruction experts, all of whom arrived at a startling uniform conclusion. The injuries to Duncan's body were not, by any scientific standard, consistent with being crushed and slowly torn apart by glacial forces. They were the result of a rapid, focused, and powerful mechanical action. Dr. John Butt, a renowned forensic pathologist who had worked on numerous high-profile cases, was particularly categorical. He noted that the dismemberment was traumatic, not merely, post-mortem erosion. The clean, defined cuts, the specific pattern of bone fragmentation, and the absence of any injury that would have caused immediate death before the dismemberment all pointed to a single, terrible moment of impact. The force required to cleanly amputate a large man's lower leg, and both forearms suggested a device of immense power. The presence of fresh blood found at the initial discovery site, which was later determined to be Duncan's, further undermined the Glacier theory, which would have dictated that any blood would have been long since frozen and dispersed through the ice flow over 14 years. The blood was a fresh sign of the body's new exposure, but the manner in which the initial Austrian recovery team handled the site was another devastating blow to the investigation. The resort staff, not trained forensic experts, were the ones who managed the initial recovery of the remains and evidence, an act that all but guaranteed the contamination and loss of crucial clues. The area was not properly secured, and the opportunity for a thorough, systematic forensic sweep of the discovery site was lost forever. The McPhersons, driven by a terrible instinct, returned to the site after the official recovery was complete. It was during this intensely emotional and agonizing visit that they made a discovery that blew the entire case wide open. Sifting through the muddy, melted glacial runoff, Linda McPherson discovered small, crucial remnants that the official recovery had entirely missed. A fragment of Duncan's clothing, a piece of bone, and then, most crucially, a pendant, a silver St. Christopher medal that Duncan had always worn. This was evidence of a shocking level of negligence, or worse, a willful dismissal of the importance of the scene. The fact that the family, with no formal training, could find such vital personal effects spoke volumes about the quality of the initial Austrian investigation. The discovery of the pendant and the overlooked fragments of bone and clothing forced the authorities to admit their oversight, but their cooperation remained minimal. The investigators, backed by the powerful local resort, continued to maintain a defensive stance. The resort, a significant economic engine for the region, had a vested interest in the narrative of the unavoidable accident. The possibility of a snowcat operator having accidentally killed a tourist and then secretly disposed of the body represented a catastrophic legal and public relations nightmare. The implications were enormous: negligence, manslaughter, and a deliberate cover-up orchestrated or at least sanctioned by high-level management. The McPherson suspicions crystallized around the simple yet chilling sequence of events. Duncan falls, he's injured, the snowcat, operating in the thick fog of the early morning hours, accidentally strikes him, and then, in a moment of panicked, terrible decision, the driver, or perhaps a supervisor called to the scene, decides to bury the evidence in a shallow, temporary burial site. The body, hidden in the snow, would then be dragged by the glacier's movement over the next 14 years, its final resting place, the site of the 2003 discovery, being miles down slope from the actual place of death. This was the narrative that finally made sense of the horrific trauma, the baffling location, and the incredible secrecy surrounding the initial missing person case. The physical evidence, the nature of the injuries, and the location of the discovery became the true, irrefutable testimony of Duncan's final moments, a testimony that contradicted every word of the official Tyrolean account. The investigation, propelled by the McPhersons' unwavering forensic evidence, pivoted to the snowcat drivers and the resort's management on that fateful August night in 1989. The narrative now centered on a conspiracy of silence, a moral and criminal failure of profound magnitude. If the said injuries were caused by a snowcat, someone knew. The machine was massive, its noise and vibration unmistakable. A collision of that force could not have gone unnoticed by the operator. The focus zeroed in on the maintenance logs and shift schedules from the night of August 9th to the morning of August 10th. The difficulty lay in the passage of 14 years, the fading of memories, and the convenient loss of critical records. Yet, the McPhersons and their privately hired investigators managed to piece together fragments of information that suggested a deep well of withheld knowledge within the resort community. There were whispers, rumors that surfaced years later, of an unusual night operation, of a driver who seemed rattled or spoke of a near miss. The narrative structure now followed a classic true crime trajectory. The pursuit of the guilty conscience in a small, closed community. The sheer audacity of the alleged cover-up to run over a man and then use the very machine that killed him to bury his body was a testament to the primal fear of ruin and exposure. The body was likely dragged or scooped into a shallow crevasse or a snow storage area, hastily covered, and then smoothed over by the snowcat's powerful tiller, eliminating all immediate evidence of the tragedy. The Glacier, the very engine of the resort's livelihood, then took over the process of concealment, carrying the remains into its frozen depths for a decade and a half. The McPhersons learned that the resort operated a fleet of these massive machines, and identifying the specific driver became the next seemingly insurmountable obstacle. They pressed the authorities to re-interview all former employees, to administer polygraph tests, and to pursue the physical evidence. Specifically, a meticulous forensic examination of the recovered remains for trace evidence of metal or paint that could link Duncan to a specific machine. Predictably, the requests were met with bureaucratic stonewalling. The local police had concluded their initial inquiry with the vague, non-committal finding of an unexplained death, a conclusion that satisfied their need for closure, but offered none to the McPhersons. The emotional weight of this resistance was immense. The McPhersons were not just fighting for justice. They were fighting a systemic denial, a multi-layered defense mechanism built to protect the financial and reputational interests of a major European ski destination. The contrast between the sheer, heartbreaking physical reality of Duncan's mangled remains and the dry, legalistic dismissal of the Tyrolean authorities created a sense of profound injustice. The lack of an immediate, comprehensive autopsy in 2003 was a failure that compounded the initial negligence of 1989. The McPhersons had to fight for the right to an independent examination, and when it was finally granted, the opportunity for certain conclusive tests had been significantly degraded by time and mishandling. The detailed descriptions of the evidence, the condition of the bones, the location of the body, became the silent testimony against the official account. The mystery now was not what killed Duncan, but who covered it up, and how high up the chain of command the knowledge of the secret went. The sheer deliberate concealment of the body suggested a level of complicity that extended beyond a panicked lone snowcat operator. Was it a supervisor who ordered the cleanup? Was it the general manager who was informed and chose to protect the resort? The McPhersons' relentless pursuit had taken them from a simple missing person case to the terrifying doorstep of an institutional cover-up, a narrative far darker and more complex than the tragic accident they had initially feared. The hope for a simple answer was gone, replaced by the grim certainty that their son's final moments had been compounded by a callous act of human deception. The final act of the McPhersons' quest for justice became an international legal and political battle. moving the focus from the cold Glacier to the cold halls of bureaucracy. Unable to extract a satisfactory resolution or a truthful narrative from the Tyrolean police, Bob and Linda McPherson took their case to the highest levels, appealing to the Canadian government and launching an unprecedented civil suit in Austria. This was a direct formal accusation against the Stubai Glacier Resort for negligence and alleged complicity in the cover-up of their son's death. The audacity of this action, a private Canadian couple taking on a powerful European corporation and a defensive state apparatus, underscored the sheer depth of their commitment. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, a grinding, expensive, and emotionally draining process. The legal discovery phase yielded a few more tantalizing fragments of information, enough to keep the theory of the snowcat cover-up alive, but never the smoking gun confession or the irrefutable document. The resort and the state maintained their stonewall, repeating the initial sanitized narrative. The battle forced the McPhersons to engage with experts in glaciology, forensic engineering, and international law, transforming their personal tragedy into a well-researched, professional investigation that far outstripped the official Austrian inquiry. They became amateur experts in the rate of glacial flow and the precise mechanics of snow grooming machinery. They had to be. Their goal was no longer merely to find Duncan, but to force the system to acknowledge the truth of his death, that he was not lost to the forces of nature, but a victim of human error and subsequent criminal deception. The persistent silence from key personnel at the resort, the convenient lapses in memory, and the destruction or loss of critical documentation became, in the McPhersons' view, evidence of guilt in itself. The common device of contrast, the joyful, athletic vitality of the Duncan. McPherson, in the archival photos set against the grim, fragmented remains recovered from the ice, was the emotional core of their public appeals. They utilized the media, telling their story to international news outlets and documentaries, applying global pressure to a regional cover-up. The narrative was simple, yet devastating. A young man's life was destroyed, and the people responsible were protected by a mountain of lies. In 2008, the Austrian court delivered a final, frustrating judgment. While they did not officially attribute the death to an accident and subsequent cover-up, thus denying the McPhersons the definitive judicial finding they craved, they did acknowledge the negligence of the resort and the police investigation. Crucially, the court awarded the McPhersons a financial settlement for the emotional pain and the costs of their private investigation. This ruling, while a small victory, was a powerful tacit admission. The official story was a lie, and the McPhersons' version of events, though unproven in the strict legal sense, was the far more probable reality. The verdict provided a sense of moral resolution but left the open loop of a perpetrator unnamed and unpunished. The identity of the snowcat operator, the person who made the terrifying decision to conceal a human life beneath the snow, remains officially unknown. The McPhersons, now elderly and exhausted by their 20-year odyssey, finally brought their son's remains home to Canada, allowing him to rest not in the cold, foreign earth, but under the wide-open skies of his native Saskatchewan. The tragic tale of Duncan McPherson is now a stark, cautionary story, a narrative of a young life violently extinguished and then erased by a deliberate cover-up. A man lost not once to the mountain, but twice, first to the machine and second to the systemic deception that sought to bury the truth alongside his body. The vast silent beauty of the Alps now carries an indelible stain, a grim monument to a life cut short, and a truth that refused to stay frozen forever. The case stands as a permanent indictment of the indifference and institutional protection that allowed a promising young man to simply vanish, only to be recovered 14 years later as a terrifying fragmented testament to the horrific certainty that had haunted his parents for so long. The legacy of the McPherson case transcends the grim details of the death. It is a chilling study in institutional failure and the unbreakable will of a family. The final lingering questions remain the most powerful and, ironically, the most resistant to definitive answer. Who was the person behind the snowcat's controls that fateful night? What was the precise, terrifying sequence of events in the fog? And how was the secret kept so flawlessly for 14 years within a relatively small, interconnected community of resort employees? The answers are still held by the living, a secret buried not in a crevasse, but within the confines of human memory and conscience. The McPhersons' tireless efforts, their transformation from grieving parents to relentless international investigators, are a dramatic centerpiece of the entire narrative. They became the sole repository of the case's momentum, continually feeding the fire of inquiry with their own resources and emotional capital. The contrast between their quiet determination and the official, state-sanctioned lethargy became a potent theme, highlighting the fundamental imbalance of power between the individual and the entrenched system. Their findings of additional evidence on the glacier after the official cleanup, the pendant, the bone fragments, were not just evidence of oversight. They were a metaphorical indictment of the Austrian inquiry. The investigators' lack of thoroughness suggested they were not looking for a crime, but for a convenient justification for an unavoidable accident. The emotional weight of the narrative culminates in this enduring lack of closure. The court case, though financially successful, left the truth legally ambiguous, leaving the McPhersons with a moral victory, but without the definitive public confession or conviction that would have honored Duncan's memory. The story then becomes a meditation on the nature of justice. Does it require a court ruling, or can it be achieved through the relentless public telling of the true story, a form of historical storytelling that holds the powerful to account? The case forced a confrontation with the reality of a world where profit and reputation can outweigh the value of a single young life. The vastness of the glacier, which initially seemed to represent a random cosmic form of loss, now represents the vastness of the deception, an enormous, cold, and slow-moving cover-up that required immense power to maintain. The fact that the story came to light only because of the unpredictable, dramatic action of climate change, the unprecedented melting of the glacier, adds a layer of cosmic irony to the tragedy. It was not human justice that exposed the secret, but the earth itself, slowly yielding its dark prisoner to the light. The McPhersons' final act of taking Duncan home, his remains repatriated, was the conclusion of their physical search, but not the end of their story. They established a foundation in his name, transforming their private, harrowing ordeal into a public mission to support families with missing loved ones overseas. The tragedy was thus transmuted into advocacy, a final powerful testimony to Duncan's life and the injustice of his death. The tale of Duncan McPherson serves as a profound open loop in the history of international cold cases. A stark reminder that sometimes the most definitive answers are found not in the courtroom, but in the harrowing, meticulously researched narrative of a tenacious family that simply refused to stop looking. The silence of the Alps still holds its secrets, but the story of the Canadian hockey player found in the ice ensures that the world will never stop listening for the truth. The enduring image of Duncan McPherson's story is the St. Christopher pendant, a small silver symbol of protection, recovered from the mud by his mother's own hands, long after the official search had concluded. This single, detailed piece of evidence, so easily missed by the professionals, perfectly encapsulates the entire tragedy and the subsequent fight for truth. A St. Christopher medal is meant to guard travelers, yet it was found abandoned on a dirty glacier, a testament to the fact that whatever protection Duncan sought or was granted, it failed in his final, terrifying moments. The act of the McPhersons sifting through the remains of the site became a powerful, recurring device, a visceral representation of a family's love literally digging for a truth that was being actively concealed. The discovery of the pendant and the other remnants utterly discredited the Austrian police's handling of the scene, transforming their negligence into something that felt entirely deliberate. The question shifts from how could they miss this evidence to why did they rush the cleanup and recovery in such a way that vital clues were guaranteed to be lost. This leads directly back to the most sinister element of the narrative, the cover-up itself. The logistical impossibility of an event of this magnitude being unknown to management is a significant point of emotional weight. A snowcat is a loud, conspicuous machine. An accident involving a human body, one that required the kind of cleanup and burial implied by the forensic evidence, would have required significant time and coordination. The emotional arc of the narrative hinges on the horrific certainty that at least one person, and likely more, carried the secret of Duncan's death for 14 years. Imagine the internal psychological toll. The operator, returning to the scene of the crime every night to groom the very slope that held the victim, working directly over the shallow grave of a young man he accidentally or negligently killed. This provides a level of dramatic, psychological tension that elevates the case beyond a mere accident. The narrative structure concludes with the profound sense of a justice, denied in the formal sense, but achieved in the moral and informational one. The McPhersons ensured that the world knows not just that Duncan died, but how he most likely died, and that a powerful resort and state agency colluded to hide the evidence. The final legal resolution, while a compromise, was a financial recognition of the pain and the cost of uncovering a truth that should have been provided by the state. This financial compensation, in a strange twist, affirmed the family's narrative by making the resort pay the cost of the very investigation they had tried so hard to thwart. The story of Duncan McPherson is therefore a true crime documentary that serves as a grim cautionary tale, an examination of how fear and self-interest can turn an accident into a crime, and how an institutional will to silence can only be defeated by a personal, unrelenting will to remember. The facts of the case, from the rusted arrowhead of the glacier to the silver gleam of the pendant, all speak the same language, one of violent trauma, followed by a cold, deliberate betrayal. The case, though closed in a judicial sense, remains perpetually open in the court of public opinion, a permanent testament to the truth that was almost buried forever in the deep, indifferent ice.